It might be working now. I just got an alert that Facebook or that we're live streamed. Okay, I think it's working. It is. Okay, thank you, Candace.
You're welcome.
Okay. Let's see. Let me get my notes back pulled up. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Sorry, we're a few minutes late. We had some technical difficulties. And we're so excited to discuss an update on our electronic ID rule and the lawsuit that was filed last week. We have some special guests with us today, and we'll give a little more of an intro to everybody here in a bit. But we have my boss, Bill Bullard, the RCAF USA CEO, and then we have Cara Rollins, Judith McGarry, Chuck Willard, and Kenny Fox. But before we get started, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and let us know if you have any questions as we go. A reminder that we do have a petition going on at stopmandatory.eid.com. So please go over and sign that and help us just continue to show the mass opposition to this issue. Another reminder is that RCAF USA operates off of solely membership dues and donations. So your donation and your membership makes work like this possible, and it allows us to fight for all cattle producers and to just do work like this and to keep on doing it. So with that, Bill, I'm going to hand it off to you to kind of get us started here. If you will.
Thank you and welcome for joining us today. So RCAF USA members include those who participate voluntarily in a RFID or electronic identification program, some of which are for the purpose of the non-hormone treated cattle that go on to Europe. And so our members are using this in many instances, receiving a premium in the marketplace. But our membership overwhelmingly opposes the government mandating the exclusive use of EID tags for everybody under a one-size-fits-all. And we were first had to address this back in early 2019 when, after producers had began complying with the 2013 rule, the U.S. Department of Agriculture and then Secretary of Agriculture Sonny Perdue issued a fact sheet stating that by January 1 of 2023, only the exclusive use of RFID ear tags would be allowed. And so at that time, we asked, who is now Congresswoman Harriet Hageman, if she would represent us in a lawsuit against what we viewed to be a clearly unlawful action on the part of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And at the time, Congresswoman Harriet Hageman was then working for the New Civil Liberties Alliance. And she enlisted the help of Cara Rollins, a colleague, to represent RCAF in that initial case. Of course, within a couple of weeks or 3 weeks of filing the complaint, the USDA withdrew its mandate. And we then waited until now, and we have a second mandate, this one a more formidable mandate in the form of a final rule. And when that rule was issued, we again approached the New Civil Liberties Alliance. Specifically, I talked to Cara Rollins and asked if she would again represent independent cattle producers against this unlawful action by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And she agreed. And that's why she's here today and why a lawsuit was filed. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Cara Rollins, the attorney representing independent producers, specifically the plaintiffs that you're visiting with today, and to let her talk about the lawsuit itself. So Cara, please.
Well, thanks, Bill, for that introduction. Thank you for everybody that's on here. I know this is a busy time of year, so I do appreciate you sort of being here for this update. When Bill approached us, as well as, Judith and South Dakota Stock Growers Association, for us, it was a quick and easy yes. We'd obviously been watching this issue develop over the past few years. Our organization is really interested in the way that government intrusions on civil liberties, or the way I always explain, and this is a good case for an example of that, is that, in our system of government, each division has a role, right? And so Congress sometimes puts guardrails on the agencies on what they can do, right? I mean, the powers that they can operate under. And I think in recent years, what we've seen from the administrative state is either complete ignorance of sort of the powers that are given to them, or just blowing past the guardrails that are provided to them. And so one of the things that NCLA is interested in is just holding government agencies to account to make sure that we're protecting the civil liberties of individuals from encroachments by sort of unlawful agency power. This is a great sort of, unfortunately, great and common issue. I don't, I know when you're in this position and it's your cattle and your business and your livelihood, it feels sometimes like it's personal. I think the unfortunate answer is this is just standard business for the government, most unfortunately. And I think that, the good is that we do have an opportunity here to sort of make a lasting determination. I know Judith will talk about this a little bit more about the history of the rules and how we got here. But, one of the things that sticks out in my mind as part of this case is that the 2013 ADT rule was a negotiated position, right? Nobody's necessarily happy by that. But ever since that point, certain powers within USDA and even on the outside, from what it seems from publicly available information, have been pushing for mandatory RFID. And they've had a couple fits and starts, as Bill explained. We first worked with RCAF back in 2019 when they issued their fact sheet. At that time, our concern was that they had taken a final rule, the 2013 ADT rule, and completely modified it by just issuing a document online. We call that unlawful agency guidance, doesn't have the force of law. And I think very quickly after pointing that out to the agency, they removed the fact sheet. In 2020, that summer, they tried again by notice to, again, change the official ID to RFID. They retracted that again. So when I say there's fits and starts, I think the agency in some ways has been poking around the fence on it before it came to this final rule. They put it out for notice and comment. I want to say, I forget the exact numbers. I think there's over 1,900 comments. I don't know the exact numbers and ratios. We will at some point get the administrative record. At least when I went through it, it was overwhelmingly, in my read, against the rule for a lot of the reasons we'll discuss. A lot of the reasons that, you here attending are sort of like intimately aware of because it affects your business, your cows, your families, and how your operations go. So we looked at the rule when it came out, and, one of the things that we thought about when we were looking at this is, and many of you might have heard of the case, overturning Chevron Deference. And what that historically meant is that courts would defer to agencies' interpretations of ambiguous or silent statutes. And so if you had a statute where the statutory authority was, we'll call it squishy for lack of a better term, right? It's either silent or ambiguous. It's not explicit. What courts would then do is they'd say, well, it's ambiguous. We don't really know what Congress meant. There's some, indicators here, but we'll defer to the agency so long as their interpretation was reasonable. And there's all kinds of cases that if you looked at them sort of historically, where you'd say, well, that's not reasonable, but the rule of Chevron step 2 is generally agency wins. The statistics showed that they were winning at about a 90% rate. And I think that there are instances like this, rules like this, where the agency had sought to issue it in a pre-Chevron world, and sort of found themselves after Loper Bright and Relentless, which myself, as well as John Vecchione, who was one of the other NCLA attorneys on this case, represented a group of the fishermen in that case, and overturning Chevron deference. I think the government's not going to have that to its benefit. And so how does that work in this? Well, the agencies only have the power that Congress gives them. And in that grant, the Animal Health Protection Act places some limitations on how USDA can act, what it can and cannot do. And so, for example, the primary authority under the Animal Health Protection Act is about the secretary prohibiting or restricting the movement of interstate commerce of certain animals to prevent the introduction or dissemination of any pest or disease of livestock. That's like the thrust of what they're hanging on to. The secretary may also promulgate regulations, which means issue like regulations that they deem necessary to achieve the means of the act. The way they sort of enforce this is through civil and criminal penalties. And then there's another act that's at play. We call this the Regulatory Flexibility Act. This act is really sort of looking at costs to small businesses, small entities, that when the agencies are doing regulations that have certain economic impacts on those small entities, that the agencies are forced to go through a process that really thinks about how that works. We think that that's a really important statute in this instance, because by APHIS's own data, something like 99% of beef cattle farms and 91% of dairy cattle farms are considered small within the meaning of the Regulatory Flexibility Act. And so certainly, one of the current concerns I had when reading this, and I'm not a math major, I'm just a lawyer, was that some of the government's numbers just don't add up. They say this affects 11 million. They make sort of statements in the final rule that, well, small producers don't move their cows across state lines, and therefore they're wrong that it's going to affect them. But the reality is, the APHIS, on the other hand, has also said, well, 99% of beef cattle come from small producers. So there's a lot of inconsistencies here that we think the regulatory flexibility analysis plays into. But the bigger one we're looking at is how the Animal Health Protection Act, what it provides the agency the ability to do, what the agency has done here, and where there's discrepancies between them. And we think there's some pretty significant ones, particularly regarding the power to regulate it all. As I mentioned before, the trigger is the program necessary? And what you see, and what you classically see in some of the case law on this, is that if there's inherent or internal inconsistencies between sort of the rule and the analysis and what's done, that's what we would call typically arbitrary and capricious, which is a reason to overturn or vacate a rule. And we think that that's very much at play here. And what do I mean by that? Well, if a rule is necessary, it means you need to do it in order to achieve the ends of the statute, which is animal health and to protect against disease. Well, what does this rule do? Well, by APHIS's own explanations, they say, well, we'd like it if it covered more. I mean, I think some of the data has suggested, and there's certainly comments to this effect, that historically APHIS or former individual to APHIS or USDA had said you need to cover at least 70% of the herds, the cattle in the herd. I see Judith shaking her head, so I remember that statistic correctly, in order to sort of achieve the health goals that RFID or EID ear tags would do. What's this do? It's about a 9 to 10%. It's only 11 million out of, I think, roughly 96 million head of cattle based on recent data. So that to me fails in an internal consistency issue. It fails on a necessary. How can something be necessary when it only covers a small minority of what goes on? I think the other thing is that the agency has classically and historically said for the better part of 10 years is that in order for an EID or RFID mandate to be effective, you would need all of the software, the scanning equipment, all of that in place along the entire production chain. And they don't mandate that here. Now, do we want them to mandate that? No, absolutely not. And that would raise all other sorts of issues, many probably constitutional issues that we won't get into here. But certainly if you're looking at, is this necessary? Well, they've told us what they think is necessary. And Judith points this out all the time. This is one of my favorite sort of wonky arguments in here, but I think it's actually very good as to the necessary, is that, they say the reason for the rule is, well, when we're doing animal disease traceability, things get slowed down because there's transcription errors in the data. So we can't track the cattle because when they're reading the visual tags, numbers get inverted, there's mud on it, you can't get close enough to the cattle, what have you. Somehow the number gets wrong and that delays traceability. Well, here's the thing. These tags need to be visually readable because while they must also have an EID component, you don't have to use the EID technology. You can continue to use the EID tag the same way you use the visual only tag. So all they've done is make you pay for a more expensive tag that you're going to use in exactly the same way. It may very well not reduce transcription errors, which is one of the reasons they said the rule was necessary. And so, again, this goes to this idea of internal inconsistencies within the rule itself. And I think some of these internal inconsistencies play into the Regulatory Flexibility Act analysis. And what do I mean by that? Is, we talked about that 11 million that the estimate is to attach. They've attached a $26 million a year per rule cost. Again, for this to work, it would be a significantly more expensive process. You would have to tag more cattle. You would have to have more equipment. So in some ways, it's hard to look at what the agency did here and not say that they narrowed the universe of cattle they say are affected in order to avoid the true cost of the rule, which would have triggered other protections under the Regulatory Flexibility Act. And that's something that's truly concerning to me. I think that sort of movement or those sorts of determinations are problematic as a whole. We expect the, sort of rule of law, right? The idea that everybody in the system understands the laws as written, they follow them, they process them. That rule of law particularly applies to the government. And so when it's kind of blatantly obvious, even to me as somewhat of an outsider, I don't come from a cattle ranching background, but I've been fortunate to work alongside folks like Bill long enough to have gleaned some knowledge from him that, there's just something it doesn't sit right. And I've tend to find in the well over a decade that I've been doing this type of work on behalf of entities and individuals across the country, sort of standing up against the government. So when something doesn't feel right, it's usually a reason to that. So that's a very high level explanation. I'm more than happy to maybe answer some more specific questions later on, but I do want to turn it over to Judith, who can give some sort of ways that this historically fits into what's gone on in animal disease traceability.
So Judith is the executive director at Farm and Ranch Freedom Alliance and is also her organization is a co-plaintiff alongside us. So Judith, kind of talk to us about your organization and your history with the electronic ID fight.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate RCAF hosting this and RCAF's incredible work on the animal ID issue the whole time I've been involved, which is now coming up on 18, heading into 19 years. And Cara's final comments actually really, what they triggered for me was reminiscing about the fact that in 2006, when I left my law practice and founded FARFA, and we were fighting animal ID the first time, then called the National Animal ID System. And it was a plan to require anyone who owned even one cow, any livestock animal, any poultry, to register their property with the government, tag each animal for everything except poultry. It was going to be electronic ID, and report their movements to a database within 24 hours. Anytime an animal was sold, anytime it went anywhere, you'd have to call up and report this or file an online report. And it was this crazy program. I actually dismissed it as an online rumor when I first started hearing about it. And then I saw the USDA documents and started digging and went, this isn't a rumor. This is the laid out plan that was supposed to be mandatory, all 3 phases nationwide by January 1st of 2009. And I remember talking with a mentor of mine and just saying, this makes no sense. This literally just makes no sense. And he said, yes, it does. You just have to figure out from whose viewpoint does it make sense. It makes no sense for small farmers. It makes no sense for independent ranchers, for consumers, for anybody, but it makes really good sense for meat packers who want to have just a wide open export and import market. It makes great sense for agribusiness entities that at the time were looking at running those databases. It makes amazingly good sense for the technology companies who were going to sell millions of EID tags every year under this program. And that's still the case. And that's still what we're facing. And that's why I go back to that initial history. Because as Cara was laying out, this rule by itself, there's 2 things about it. One is it's very narrow. I mean, so there are a lot of people out there, lots of farmers and ranchers, lots of FARFA members who look at me and go like, really, is this such a big deal? It's only for the people who cross state lines, you just tag. Yeah, it's a more expensive tag, but it's not that much more expensive. And, they're going to cross state lines. What's the big deal? Some are outraged, some are crossing state lines, some are just normally outraged by it, but it's less obvious. You don't look at it the way you looked at the NACE program and everybody went, oh my God, this is horrible. This is far more subtle, far more narrow. So it takes understanding that this rule doesn't make sense by itself. It won't work. It cannot achieve what USDA has said it wants to achieve. It must be the first step on a multi-step path right back to what they set out with the National Animal Identification System. And so, they set that out in 2005. I became aware of it in 2006, founded FARFA with other farmers and ranchers. And, we worked to fight it and worked with National Coalition, including RCAF again, that has been an amazing partner throughout this. And finally, in 2010, then Secretary Vilsack, in the first version of Secretary Vilsack, said, fine, we'll withdraw the program. We've heard you. We've heard this overwhelming protest against it. And they said, we're going to put together a much narrower, farmer-friendly, rancher-friendly program. And we spent 3 years negotiating that out. I was one of the people on a 20-member advisory committee, the Secretary's Advisory Committee on Animal Health. And every meeting of that advisory committee, we had other topics, but animal ID was at its core. We went through negotiation after negotiation. There were other forums which were negotiating this, and ultimately came out with a rule that, as Cara briefly touched on as she started, was it what I would have written? Like if I could have waved a wand and said, here's what we should be doing? No, it wasn't. But it was something that USDA said met their needs for increasing traceability for animal health. And it involved low-tech options and was limited in scope to where it wasn't going to create a significant new burden on farmers and ranchers. It created new costs, it created new issues, but they were manageable. They were things that people could absorb, people could manage. And that's worked. It's worked beautifully for years, or beautifully maybe it's worked. It's been functioning. And USDA's own analyses tell us that in the proposal for this new rule, they said, in general, most cases, we can trace back a cow that has crossed state lines within an hour. I mean, that's actually pretty extraordinary. They don't tell us how often it breaks down. They don't tell us really, they don't give a really good statistical analysis of, well, when it does break down, here's how long it does take. They simply offer us the conclusion that it breaks down too often. And when it breaks down, it's because of these transcription problems. That's it. If you're going to change something that was negotiated over 3 years with stakeholders of every type across the country, surely we deserve more than simply this conclusory statement of here's where the problem is, or that there is a problem. Here's where the problem is. Oh, and here's the solution that on its face cannot solve it. So we're very proud to be a plaintiff, one of the co-plaintiffs in this case, and appreciate NCLA taking it on. I am an attorney. I'm not an attorney on this case. I don't practice anymore. We are a client. But I'll say, as an attorney, people often have come to us and said, well, what about a lawsuit? All sorts of things. And I'm like, here's a good role for lawsuits. And they never replace individuals raising their voices. The lawsuit, we hope we have a good case and we hope for success. And in the meantime, it's really important for people who aren't in the lawsuit to be speaking up. Our FARFA members, RCAF members, and people who aren't members to be speaking up and talking to their elected officials in Congress, and saying, this is a problem. Why is USDA doing this to our farmers and ranchers? And it can even start at the local level. Kenny can speak briefly. He's forwarded me recently a resolution that was adopted in a county speaking out against this. And on the FARFA website, we actually have sample municipal resolutions. And the thing about these sorts of resolutions is they help spread the word. They help people in your community start understanding what the problem is, that this is even happening. Let's start with how many people are unaware that this is happening. These resolutions help them become aware it's happening, and it can create that swell of opposition like we built back in 2006, 7, 8, 9 that stopped NAIS and can help create that sort of swell of opposition again. So I want to keep my comments short so that there's time for Kenny and Chuck and questions afterwards. Thank you all for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Judith. So that brings us to Chuck, is the president of the South Dakota Stock Growers Association. So Chuck, your organization is also a co-plaintiff. And so kind of talk about your organization's interest and your involvement in this lawsuit.
Yeah, thank you. I'm real happy to be here today and to share a little bit about South Dakota Stock Growers. Many of you know we are the oldest producer organization in the United States, and we were one of the very first to support RCAF, and we've been behind them 100% from the very beginning, and just appreciate so much what they do. This morning when I was writing, I was kind of thinking about our country and when it first got started, and when we were fighting the British, and Paul Revere would ride through the countryside saying, "The British are coming, the British are coming." And I thought, RCAF's kind of that way. They're riding through the communities right now saying, "The government's coming, the government's coming." And this EID deal, it is not popular. Most people do not want it. They have no problem with a voluntary EID. But when we look at across South Dakota and across the nation, most producers are not happy with this at all. It's not needed by any sense. And when you look at the organizations that support it, NCBA, Farm Bureau, that is not necessarily what their customers or the members want. We've visited with a lot of them across South Dakota, especially Western South Dakota, and even though they belong possibly to these organizations, they don't necessarily agree with them on this case. And so overwhelmingly across the nation, I believe that this rule that they're trying to promulgate that's going to take effect is not necessary, it's not wanted, and it's not needed. And so South Dakota stock growers are passionate about this. We're right at 1,200 members strong, and our membership does not want this. So we're going to support it. We're going to continue to support RCAF. And as stated before, we need to get the word out. It's kind of like a David and Goliath type scenario. It's huge what we're taking on here. But that doesn't mean we can't be successful and that we can't win. But it will take all of us, all the organizations, all the memberships, to get on board and let their voices be heard. That's the way we're going to win. It is, this is all about control, not necessarily about animal traceability or disease traceability. The government wants control. And if we value our freedoms in this country, we've got to stop sitting back and not doing anything. But we need to engage, all of us, get involved, and take this on. Because if we don't, there is no way to win. So we need to keep fighting. And again, I'm brief too. I'm a rancher. I feel very passionate about this. And so I urge everyone, please get involved, engage, make your comments known, get out there, and we can win this deal. So thank you. Appreciate having the opportunity to be on.
Thank you, Chuck. And so that brings us to Kenny Fox. He is our RCAF USA Animal ID Chair, and he is also another plaintiff along with some other area ranchers. So Kenny, kind of give us a quick history of your involvement in this issue and kind of whatever else you'd like to add. I think you're on mute, Kenny.
Thank you. I've been involved with this along with Judith McGarry and Bill Bullard from the very start, way back in the NAIS days. And one of the things that happened then was we had a big rally in Rapid City like we just had the other day. And there was over 400 people there. And one of our members got up and asked how many people are opposed to this rule. And first of all, he said, well, how many people in the room? And they said there was well over 400. How many support it? There was 3 people that stood up and supported it. So because of the efforts of Judith and other people that were on this working group or advisory committee, I guess would be a better way to say it, we got to the ADT that allows us to use multiple forms of official ID. Recently in Rapid City, we had another rally and a huge crowd of people from at least 9 states were there, and no one that was there was in favor of this rule. And as Cara alluded to earlier, the comments, there was roughly a little over 2,000 comments, and the vast majority of them, a huge majority, were opposed to this, and USDA just ignored us. The same thing happened to me when I was on a working group trying to stop this RFID mandate. And because I wouldn't give in, they kicked me out of the committee. So then I visited with one of the veterinarians from USDA, and they said, well, we got the authority, we'll just write this. We're just going to make it mandatory without going through the regulatory process, administrative rule process. And I said, well, what you're doing is illegal. And they said, well, we'll let the lawyers decide it. And I said, yes, we will. And we won that one, thanks to Cara and Harriet Hageman. And if you don't stand up and fight, you never get anything. And we're going to keep fighting. I would encourage everyone to contact your county commissioners and ask them to oppose this EID mandate. As like Judith said, it brings awareness to the issue. And if anyone wants a copy of this, I would be glad to give it to them. Mr. Tate wrote it in Tripp County, that's down by Winter, South Dakota. He called me the other night and asked if he could send it to me, and I said, sure. And I read it. I thought it was great. I sent it to Bill Bullard and to Cara and to Judith. And it's rather lengthy, so I won't go into it. But basically it says, we oppose it for the various reasons everyone has been talking about here today. And with that, let's see. There's more veterinarians oppose this than what one would think. There are some that are in favor of it, but most of the veterinarians in our area don't like to use the RFID tags because they're very hard to put in. And at the end of the day, after doing several hundred head of cattle, their hands are very sore and tired, and they just feel that it's unnecessary. The other thing is USDA has said that they have transcription errors with a 9-digit number with the Banks tag or Silver Bright tags. Well, so they propose a 15-digit number that can be visually read, and it's supposed to be able to be read from 30 inches away. And I talked to my veterinarian the other day, and she said, there's no way that you can read that number. You're going to have to put that cow in a chute and catch her by the head, and so you can read that number. And so that isn't any different than what we've been doing for a long time. So this rule is actually, in my opinion, very redundant. It doesn't really solve anything. The big scare tactic out there is that if we have an FMD outbreak, we got to have this. Well, God forbid if we ever have an FMD outbreak, a tag is not going to solve anything. It spreads so fast. The disease has an incubation period of 2 to 14 days. And meanwhile, it's spreading the disease in that incubation period. And the way cattle move in commerce in the United States, in 24 hours, they can be from one end of the country to the other. Meanwhile, you're spreading the disease. It can travel up to 60 miles on a humid climate. So it's pointless. Their argument is pointless as far as I'm concerned when it comes to FMD. It rather rankles me really to where they're trying to scare people and coerce them into doing this. And I could go on for a long time, but I think there might be some people that like to ask questions, and I thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Kenny. Bill, what would you like to add? I'm sure you have some insight. You're on mute.
Appreciate everyone's comments on explaining what this lawsuit does and why it was filed. But tomorrow, November 5th, is the effective date of this law. And this regulation has the force and effect of law. And so the lawsuit is going to take some time. But in the meanwhile, Cara Rollins has submitted a petition and a letter, a combination, to address the fact that the effective date of this rule is tomorrow. So Cara, I'd like to turn it back over to you to talk about that petition. And that leads us to what can producers do in order to get engaged, like Chuck suggested. So Cara, please.
Thanks, Bill. So the Administrative Procedure Act, which is sort of the overarching regulatory act that provides the framework for how agencies operate, provides a couple avenues for relief without having to wait for a court to act. So one of those is what we call Section 705, and that allows an agency on its own accord to postpone the effective date of a regulation while there is a sort of pending challenge to it. The other option is we call it a petition under Section 553E, which allows any sort of interested individual or party to request the agency to amend a rule in some way. So we sent a letter today to Secretary Vilsack asking them to sort of exercise their authority under 705. We gave examples of other instances this year where regulations were challenged and the government did decide to postpone the effective date. We just said in the alternative, if this is not a power that you want to exercise, and please construe this request as a petition for rulemaking, and to at least seek 180 days extension on the effective date. And one of the reasons that we're sort of consistently hearing from producers, and this was one of the challenges raised in the rule, is there's just not enough tags out there. We're seeing delays from some manufacturers of up to 15 weeks. So if you had waited even until, sometime in August, about the midway period between the rule being promulgated and when it comes into effect to order your tags, you were out of luck. And so we think that there's good reasons. Our understanding is that from public reporting, including, I think, the state veterinarian for North Dakota recently came out and was talking about this issue about going through tag allotments, because the government did provide tags to states, except that they provided tags based on per head, not on how many cattle move across state lines. And as we are sort of, you want to run the math on that loosely, is that some of the largest producing states don't actually have to move their cattle across state lines. So for reasons unclear to me, there might be tags on cows that aren't going to move. But that's just how the government did the allotment. So we put that request in today. We asked the secretary to, please respond to it quickly. I think this is sometimes you get more bees with honey than with lemon or salt. I forget the way that one ends, but just to allow the agency to, as maybe a signal of good faith, sort of engage with us on this, as opposed to immediately running in and having the court do it. And I know, I've seen some comments, well, why isn't there a preliminary injunction and all of this? And this is sort of an experience base, is just because you file for a preliminary injunction, one, doesn't mean you win it, but more importantly, doesn't mean it's done quickly. There are timing processes allowed. I've had preliminary injunctions sort of, in some instances, take 6-7 months, asking the agency to delay this on its own accord. I mean, the secretary could do that tomorrow. And so I think that there are some advantages, but I do think it's one of those things where, look, this has never been litigated, right? 2013 was negotiated. This is the first time it's truly being litigated. They mooted it the last time. We hope that the agency will sort of take this time to understand this is really affecting producers negatively and come be sort of somewhat of a partner. If the court's going to decide, give the court time to decide. One, because there aren't enough tags out there, but the other thing, and some folks have asked us about the enforcement mechanism. This is something that we do raise in the case that I only mentioned in passing earlier, is that it's not actually clear from the statute that regulations promulgated by the secretary under the Animal Health Protection Act are actually enforceable under the law. And what do I mean by that? I mean that, and this is something for the court, so don't go out and act on this, but I'm just saying that we think that this is a real sort of power of government problem is that the statute says that violations of this chapter, meaning the Animal Health Protection Act, are enforceable for criminal and civil penalties under certain circumstances. And what we see in other statutes across the board is that if those civil and criminal penalty provisions are going to reach down into regulatory violations, the statute has to authorize them. That didn't happen here. And again, I think that, we do know from some publicly available information that the current rule, the 2013 rule, has been enforced using those penalty provisions. And so, there is certainly a discrepancy there. That said, if you have cattle who were tagged today or before, that tag is good for the life of the cow. And so for the life of the animal. So we think sort of in the interim, isolating how many people would actually be affected by this, and certainly having individuals with standing, which means that they would have to tag their cattle in the time frame is part of, sort of why we're taking a slightly different approach and going the rulemaking and request approach as opposed to a preliminary injunction. So I know, Bill, that's come up with a lot of your members, but we think that from a strategic point, that this is a better opportunity to sort of work in good faith with the agency while we let the judicial process go through.
And this is how everyone listening today can help. You can call the U.S. Department of Agriculture, call the Secretary's office. I'm going to give the number here in just a moment. You can call your members of Congress and urge them to contact the Secretary's office to favorably consider the letter and petition that has been filed to delay the effective date of the November 5th implementation of the law. This is something you can do this afternoon and all day tomorrow. So here's the number to the Secretary of Agriculture's office. It's 202-720-3631. Again, that's 202-720-3631. But don't forget to call your congressional delegation. Ask both your senators and your representative to make a contact to the U.S. Department of Agriculture to encourage him to postpone the implementation, the effective date of this law, as well as to call attention to this issue whereby the U.S. Department of Agriculture is trying to unlawfully manage how you run your operation, how you manage your cattle. And that's what this is all about. So thank you.
So we just had another question, Cara, of where did this get filed and why did we specifically file it there?
So we filed in the Federal District Court of the District of South Dakota. One that just sort of stems from where members and the parties are located. But one of the things that we do know is that states that do not have in-state production facilities are adversely affected by this rule. So states like Wyoming and South Dakota particularly, producers have to tag their cows in many cases in order to sell them. So, it just sort of made sense to go where the most affected populations were.
Gotcha. So then we have reports from around the country of the state vets are sending around letters to veterinarians that are being told that they are only allowed to use those EID tags instead of the metal ear clips. What can those producers do, if anything, Cara?
Well, up until today, that would be false information. Is that up until today, any the official ID tag as of today, it still includes those visual only ID tags. So to the extent that folks are being told that was incorrect information. Unfortunately, from tomorrow forward, which is the implementation date, unless the secretary does decide to postpone or delay it, that would, to the extent that tags are being placed and have to be placed, it would have to be an RFID or EID compliant ear tag. And so, that's a bigger problem, right? I mean, that's a problem with the rule, I think, more generally, is in drawing this as narrowly as USDA did, nobody, and I think this includes USDA, fully understands how this is going to impact producers, because that was a very clear, easy thing to get right, is saying, well, if you can keep putting metal tags on until November 4th. But apparently, I haven't seen these letters, but, to the extent that they were being told something different, then that was simply incorrect information that was being provided to the veterinarians.
Gotcha. Another thing I want to bring up is, Bill, I don't know if you're the best person to answer this or whoever wants to answer it, let's talk about also, in addition to the lawsuit, we have our continued work in Congress that's going to continue, even alongside this lawsuit. So whoever wants to kind of touch on that.
Do you mind if I jump? So absolutely. So there's been already resolutions introduced to require USDA or to vacate USDA's rule in Congress. The clock's ticking on those. They expire when this session of Congress expires. And given the number of days left, I'll be candid, the chances of them passing are pretty darn low. And they're still very important, because the more members of Congress that sign on to these resolutions of disapproval against the USDA's rule, the more well situated we are to come back in January and say, okay, new Congress. So some of you already know about this, some of you don't, but here's an issue that a lot of people care about, and we need you to do something. We need you to step up and do something now. So I actually realized I don't have the resolution numbers in front of me, which is a terribly stupid thing to have done. But you can go to, I know RCAF has it on their website, or you can go to our website, which is farmandranchfreedom.org. And we have a tab for news on animal ID. We've actually got a whole animal ID action center. And it's got sample scripts for calling Congress. So like, what if you're somebody who's never called Congress, and by the way, I'd never called my member of Congress or my state legislator before I started FARFA, so no judgment there at all. Most people haven't. But, here's a sample script. Here are the bill numbers. Here's what you can say, some talking points. And let me just take a moment and emphasize how important those calls are. A lot of folks have gotten very used to the click button, sign a petition. Here it is. And that's very helpful for gathering names and showing sort of like, here's the long list of all the people all at once who are against something. And there's a value in that. And members of Congress want to hear from their constituents. Believe it or not, I know we all think they don't. I think everyone sort of believes like they don't want to hear from us. And there may be moments they don't want to hear from us. Okay, let's be real. And it is very true that when I talk to any elected official, state, local, federal, it doesn't matter. They count those phone calls. They pay attention to phone calls in a way that they don't pay attention to form emails, to anything else pretty much short of an in-person visit. So make those phone calls, call members of Congress, tell them you want them to sign on to those congressional resolutions of disapproval, and help give us some momentum and power coming in to fight this and get Congress to finally take action, as they should. The idea of overturning Chevron very much was about, as Cara was talking about, Chevron was about saying, you know what, Congress just sort of paints this big picture and the agencies fill it in. And now it's no, Congress needs to actually say what it is they want the agencies to do much more clearly, much more specifically. That's really, in a lot of ways, the impact of this new law, not new law, but new Supreme Court decision. So let's get Congress to live up to that on this issue. Let's get Congress to say what it is should be happening on the issue of animal traceability and animal tagging. And we've got lots of resources in addition. We've got the sample municipal resolutions. We've got samples letters to the editor and op-eds, so you can spread word in your community. What we need is a groundswell of activism.
Yep, and I linked that in the comments. So whoever wants to go to that link, it's in the comments. I have another question, or last question, I think, and I don't even know if it's really a question, but the former NCBA president came out, I think it was last week, and said animal disease traceability is not some sort of government conspiracy. So who would like to rebut that and clear that answer? Bill, I feel like that's a you.
Well, what this clearly is the government overreaching its authorities, as Cara described. They have acted without regard to the statutory limitations that Congress has placed on them. And this is about control. It's about gaining more managerial control over the livelihoods of independent livestock producers. In fact, dictating to them how they must manage their cattle as a condition of moving them across state lines in phase one. As Judith described, this is phase one, because in order for this rule to be effective, there must be another rule in the pike. And that second rule is going to impose even more burdensome costs. And that's why it's so important to stop this, because the government simply has no business getting involved in your business in a manner that they have done in this case, trying to use as a pretext animal disease traceability in order to impose a burdensome cost on independent producers. And so while not a conspiracy, it certainly is a clear example of the government trying to gain inappropriate control over the lives and operations of our nation's U.S. independent cattle producers.
Very good. Okay, well, as we wrap up, does anybody have any last comments or anything they want to add?
This is Chuck. I believe, just to comment on what Bill said, it's not just the traceability. What we are using now with our brands and the ear tags and the metal tags, if one system goes down, we have something to fall back on. If they go to just the one tag and that's all we can use, and they lose that, which the retainability is very bad on these tags, any tags that you'd use, then there's nothing else to trace that cattle with. So let's make it voluntary. Let's keep what we have that's been working and is still working very well, very quickly. And if one of those, if you lose a tag or the metal clip comes out, you still have your brand and you still have one of the others. So it just makes more sense, if you're worried about disease and traceability, to have all these things in place to use instead of putting it all on one system that, as far as I'm concerned, computers are great, but I hate them. And there's a lot of problems when they go down. It takes a long time to get them fixed. So let's keep this voluntary. And the traceability thing is here for us right now.
Well, and to Chuck's point, I heard from a producer the other day that he had run some cattle for people from Texas, and they had been there 4 or 5 years ago. He's still finding electronic ear tags that have fell out of those cattle's ears. And despite what USDA says that there's a good retention of those tags, it's just not true. So if we, like Chuck says, if we rely on just the electronic tags, what's going to happen here in, say, 10 years, and we don't have a cow that has a tag in her ear? They have no traceability at all. So multiple forms of official ID is a smart thing to have a good animal disease traceability.
Anything else, Bill, Judith, Cara? Nope.
Appreciate everybody's time.
Yep.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Well, like they said, thank you all for getting on this live with us. And thank you to our guests for joining us today. And like we said, contact the Secretary of Ag, contact your senators and representative, and keep elevating this issue. We'll continue to keep you updated and let us know what questions you have, and we'll do our best to get all of them answered to the best of our ability. With that, have a great rest of your day. Candace, I think we're good to stop the live.